Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this great conversation about how to support women's economic empowerment post-pandemic. Taking a few seconds here as people join us, but really excited to have everyone here. As many of you know, COVID-19 has disproportionately affected women's health, their economic position, and there's been a lot of social effects as well. And what we've really seen is that this health and economic crisis is exacerbating existing inequalities. So we'll be talking about COVID-19's impact on women, on their economic livelihoods, and really trying to look at potential solutions and sort of this idea that we've been hearing a lot about lately of how to build back better. Are there ways to sort of, emerge from this crisis in a way that could be, better for women's economic participation than things were in the past, despite the, real negative effects that we've seen thus far. I wanted to take a moment to say that we are joined today by a live illustrator, Chris Shipton. So thanks for joining us, Chris. And you'll be able to see throughout how he's sort of illustrating our conversation. And we will be sharing his illustration with all of you afterwards. I also wanted to let you know that we'll be doing a Q&A sort of at the end of our discussion. So as questions pop up for you throughout, please click on the little Q&A icon and type in your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. We'd really like this to be an interactive conversation. We're also going to be doing a few polls throughout the conversation today. So, keep an eye out for those. Please participate. It's a really great way to sort of see where all of you are thinking, and it can help inform our conversation. So with that, I do want to go to our first poll, and I'll give my producer Julie just a second to get that up on the screen. There we go. So our first poll is, what's the number one barrier to women's economic empowerment? So if you want to go ahead and cast your votes, we'll get to those results in just a second. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we're doing this event in partnership with the CDC group. And this is part of a series of events that we've done with them, the third in that series. And you can follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtags Resilient Economies and Devex event. I'll give people maybe just another second to submit their poll answers, and then we'll close it. And let's see. So quite interesting. A pretty strong majority of folks believe that structural inequality is the number one barrier to women's economic empowerment. We'll certainly talk about some of those challenges today. So thank you all for submitting those answers. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our really great group of speakers. I know it's going to be an engaging conversation. I've enjoyed my conversations with all of them thus far. We have Mary Ellen Iskenderian, who's the president and CEO of Women's World Banking. We have Anu Madgavkar, who is the partner at the McKinsey Institute in Mumbai. We have Arpita Raksit, who's the gender lead at the CDC group, and Mamam Tari, who is the director of Economic Intelligence Center at the Bank of Africa at the BCME group. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and really looking forward to a great conversation. Anu, I think I want to start with you. What I'd like to sort of do as we kick off this conversation is get a sense of, what are the impacts that we're seeing on women as a result of this pandemic? You've done a lot of research about advancing women's equality, particularly in Africa. So can you help sort of set the scene for us? What sort of impacts are we seeing on women? How is that differing from how men are being impacted by this crisis?
Sure, thanks, Adva, and many thanks to Devex for this opportunity actually to be on this panel. As you said, we at McKinsey Global Institute have looked at the topic of gender inequality and economic empowerment in quite some depth. But it's safe to say that there's almost no time like now where this topic assumes huge importance. And in fact, later today, we are publishing an article and a perspective on how COVID-19 is affecting women's economic empowerment based on the evidence that we're seeing. So this is a bit of a preview or a sneak preview on some of those findings, which will help set the stage for the conversation, I think. I think the bottom line is that women, we find when we actually quantify, unemployment data coming out, we find that actually women are 1.8 times as vulnerable to job losses as men are on account of COVID-19. So of course, the pandemic has a whole host of very disturbing non-economic implications for women as heads of households, as frontline workers in the healthcare system. But then when you focus on the economic empowerment implications, the 1.8 times vulnerability actually does stand out. And at a global level, what this means that women are about 39% of the labor force, but account for an estimated 54% of job losses and impairment of income that we're already actually seeing across various countries. And we should get back into unpacking what drives that difference in the course of the conversation. I'm sure many things will come up, so would love to come back to that. But I do want to say that the economic implication for the world, not just the women who are going through this, but the world is actually quite immense. Because if this sort of gender gap in terms of COVID's impact is not dealt with and tackled now, we would have a value at stake of as much as, there's a 13 trillion positive opportunity by 2030 if this gender gap is addressed now. But equally, if in the do nothing scenario, if we do nothing, that would be a negative 1 trillion economic loss, right? And for every year that we delay action in addressing some of these structural inequalities, as the poll rightly pointed out, for every year that we delay action, we're actually losing, almost $1 trillion of economic value for the world at large. So it's not just doing something, but it's doing something now. And the title of this panel couldn't be more interesting. It says post-pandemic, but we actually need to start now. We can't wait for a post-pandemic recovery phase.
Great. I'm curious if, Mary Ellen, you have other thoughts on sort of some of the impacts that we're seeing in terms of access to finance or other things that sort of you found in your work as women are experiencing this pandemic. Any other sort of impacts that you're seeing?
I'd like to add my thanks to Anu's for not only inviting us, but that you're hosting this, because as Anu very rightly said, there's some really important differences that need to be called out and addressed, immediately. I think what we, as Anu pointed out, some real issues in the labor force, but I think on the financial inclusion side, which is where Women's World Banking really stays so focused, we're actually seeing some really interesting dynamics with regard to account openings, account usage, and at the risk of kind of leaping ahead to some of the opportunities that the crisis presents. We've seen, as a result of literally every country on the globe has either adapted or created some kind of government social benefits transfer program specifically in response to COVID. I'm aware of 2 countries, India and Peru, that explicitly targeted women with their benefits transfer programs. And as a result, that has seen just a really tremendous shift in account openings by women and usage by women in order to access those payments. You've seen, regulatory barriers like ID and requiring, physically showing up at a bank branch to open a bank account, just falling. All these issues that, the international standard setting bodies like FATF and the BIS issuing COVID guidance that says, that right now this is an emergency. Do everything you can to facilitate to facilitate account opening. And so, you've seen in the, 6 countries that more than 55% of the unbanked women in the world live, you've seen, upwards of 13 million new accounts open just in the last 3 months. And I have a very strong suspicion that that's a significant undercounting, particularly in the case of India, where the vast majority of those accounts came from. There was already such a strong push by the government to foster opening with the PMJDY accounts that women made up a very significant proportion of, but they were very they had some real issues of zero balances and dormancy and a lack of usage. And you've now seen, as a result of these payments being put into these accounts. So we can get into some of the, the opportunity that I see coming forward. But, the fact that you now have included, by virtue of this, this crisis, so many more men and women, but so many more women, it does seem absolutely incumbent on the global community not to let this great move forward go to waste post-pandemic. And there's lots of documentation, including some great work by both CDC and McKinsey Global Institute on the linkages between economic growth, women's labor force participation, lots of things that I can't wait to talk to you about, and financial inclusion. So if we've now got these women included, let's not lose the opportunity to build on that benefit.
Great. Arpita, I wanted to turn to you because I know that CDC is, responding to some of the immediate challenges that businesses, including women-owned businesses, but businesses also that employ women and have a direct impact on women's livelihoods in your COVID response. So can you tell us a little bit about how CDC Group is looking at supporting both women-owned businesses and trying to protect women's livelihoods in your COVID response?
Sure. And I also wanted to start by thanking you for inviting me as part of this discussion. It's just to echo what Marielle and Anu said, it couldn't be more timely and more important that we ensure that we integrate gender into our responses and our longer term responses. So CDC's response to COVID has essentially been divided into 3 pillars. The first is around preserving our portfolio, so the investments within our portfolio. And this has been our priority, looking at both the financial and impact risks that have been observed, and working with our investees to navigate some of the challenges that they've seen. The second pillar is around strengthening, and this is to really scale up both our economic and healthcare response, primarily through extending liquidity through financial intermediaries, but also looking at how we can work with the healthcare sector and providers of essential goods and essential services like food and water in our markets. And then our final area is, as we look post-recovery, how we can rebuild and play that role as a long-term partner in our markets and restore some of the economic fallout that we've observed. So across all of those pillars, we've been working to actively ensure that we're looking at this with a gender lens. I think the first thing that we've done is to try and really make explicit some of the disproportionate impacts that we have observed from past crises, and using that to see how we can try and do what we can to prevent that with this existing crisis. Much of what Anu and Mary Ellen have said in terms of workforce and in terms of access to finance for women-owned businesses, which was a problem before the crisis, and we see that potentially exacerbating, but there could be a potential opportunity as well, as like what Mary Ellen said. And so we've just been very deliberate and active in exposing some of these issues, both within CDC and within our investments, looking at specific sectors that we believe are at higher risk because women are overrepresented. And so for us, that's looking at manufacturing, agriculture, the garment sector, the healthcare, where women are obviously at the front line, and providing awareness around those areas. We've been feeding gender into a number of guidance notes that we've issued over the past few months around job protection, job security, working from home, and also looking at consumer protection as well. We've been navigating some specific challenges with our investees, so we've been providing direct advice, particularly those who are having to navigate challenges related to retrenchment or thinking about furloughs, and we've been working to really look at the data, look at the sort of job-related data to women, to see to the extent possible how some of this can be managed in a gender-balanced, gender-smart way so that women are not disproportionately impacted. And then we also have a technical assistance facility at CDC, known as CDC Plus, where we are able to provide grants and advisory services to our investees. And again, within that process, we've ensured that there is a gender lens applied to that application process. And some of the ideas and discussions that we're having with our portfolio looking at, for example, some of our manufacturing investees that are wanting to reroute some of their business activity to produce more PPE, for example. We've been discussing the importance of ensuring that PPE is designed for women, because we've recognized that as a key issue, particularly for women working in the healthcare sector. The same goes for those that are wishing to extend financial services through online banking and digital services. Our technical assistance we've been discussing how you do that, whilst at the same time being inclusive of women. So those are some of the areas that we've been working on, and we are actively, we'll probably get into the importance of data collection at some point, but we have been actively monitoring the data across sectors, across functions, to see how we can manage some of the potential fallout that we've learned from past crises as well.
Great, thank you, Arpita. I want to go now to our second poll, if we can pull that up. And I think it will sort of build on what we've talked about so far. And that's asking sort of what is the biggest challenge posed by COVID-19 to women's livelihoods? So I'll give you all a few seconds to respond to that. Great. And in just a second, I'm going to go to you, Mamoun, and maybe we can talk a little bit about, what you're seeing from a banking perspective and how you may be seeing sort of investors respond to the COVID crisis, and whether there are sort of greater challenges in supporting women or in their sort of access to finance at this moment than there have been in the past. But first, let's go to those poll results. So we have some distribution, but interestingly, about 53% of you believe that juggling the increased caretaking duties with paid labor is one of the biggest challenges. And I think it is important, we'll get into a discussion of some of the more cultural or structural issues that may be a challenge that I think is sort of related to that response. So Mamoun, can we go to you? What are you sort of seeing from investors from the banking perspective at this point in terms of supporting women?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's very strange for me to be maybe the only male of this webinar talking about women. I hope I will what I will say will bring something to the discussion, and it somehow help women to reach more autonomy and independence, or financial independence. First of all, just to draw a global picture here in Morocco and maybe a bit in Africa, from what we saw, what we have here is that women, of course, they are especially regarding entrepreneurship, and this is where we're really focusing on this, how to help women be better entrepreneurs, or at least to reach the level of entrepreneurship. What we first see is, of course, when you see the figures, that women represent less than 30% of all the entrepreneurs in Morocco, which is not that much. And they have been impacted a lot by of course, the COVID once again, because what you see is that when you have to make a trade-off, it's often male versus women. And the problem is that women, like they said earlier on, when you had the poll, they tend to stay at home, whereas men kept on working, which is not very on the, let's say, the equality aspect, which is not great. So this is from one side. The other side is that what we saw in Africa is that women are a lot more active than men, especially in, let's say, informal activity. They lead their business, and it's not a cliche when you say that women in sub-Saharan Africa, like global institutions, rather support women more than men, because they know that if they give money, they give support to women, they will use this money for children, they use this money for education, for food, etc. Whereas men might use this money for other things. So women, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, they are a very strong link to development, and they are a huge target. And what we saw in our different experiences there is that you find women nearly everywhere. It's a reality. Especially in informal sector, you find them. Now the question is, how can we help these women to scale up, to go from informal sector to formal sector, and then to have bigger companies, maybe companies that will use more employees, etc. Maybe women. This is the question. And now in Morocco, we're trying some very interesting experiences regarding this aspects as well. So today we are creating through some initiative with EBRD, like Women in Business program and other stuff, we are trying to create clubs dedicated to women. To be more precise, we have some training programs of like 7 to 8 days dedicated to a group of women. But the interesting part is not the training in itself, because when you bring these young SMEs, leaders, etc., you find lots of competence in this person. So they need training, but not that much. But what they need is to build the bonds between them and to strengthen the social capital. This is the most important thing for them, is to be able to create like a club of women, and that are keen on working together to scale up, to help each other to scale up and to be more efficient. And what we saw, for example, from one of our experience in Agadir, in this club in south of Morocco, is that in 4 months they signed for 15 contracts of a global turnover of, I think, $160,000. This is quite interesting for just small companies. So this is what we are doing today, is to strengthen bonds between women, to help them scale up, to reach another level. This is what we're working on. And for us as a bank, I said the person from the CDC said technical assistance. This is what we're offering today. Because as I often say, in Morocco, money is not the problem anymore. You have seen today that with COVID, for example, we have very strong incentives for companies led by men or women. And in some kind of programs, you have the state public guarantee fund that guarantee up to 95% of the investment. For very small companies, it guarantees 70% of the investment if it's led by women, 60% if it's led by men. So when you see these figures, see that money now is, we have money in Morocco. What we need is how to, as I said, help these women to scale up, to be more, not more efficient, but to to not even the ambition, because they're ambitious, they're efficient, they're more efficient than men, more ambitious than men, and they work better. It's just to give them the as I would say the conditions to succeed and scale up. And just to end, we have one very good example in Morocco, which is what we call cooperative. Cooperative in Morocco is something that works very well. You know, we in Morocco we have some specialties like argan oil, olive oil, etc. And you have women that gather themselves in some cooperatives and that started producing olive oil or argan oil, and now they're exporting all over the world. So let's say that we started with women living in the countryside with basically no education, and that are now conquering markets abroad. Just you give them the conditions, they can work on in Morocco through the banking system.
Thank you, Mamloun. We had one question pop up that's really related to some of the impacts we're seeing on women in this COVID crisis. And that's, we're seeing increasing reports that there are very high rates of gender-based violence, especially as people are locked down, and we're seeing gender-based violence, more violence in general in the home. But when we look at gender-based violence, we had a question that really asked, how are those sort of that increasing violence in the home impacting women's economic empowerment? Now, obviously, many of these women maybe normally work outside of the homes and now aren't, so they're facing sort of a double challenge. But I'm wondering if one of you wants to sort of take on that question.
I'm happy to offer some thoughts. So yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the other issues is definitely the increased incidence of gender-based violence. We've seen 31 million additional cases of GBV since the crisis started, and it's been predicted that there'll be an additional 15 million cases every 3 months. And so it's a real issue. I think, and actually, just yesterday, CDC, alongside EBRD and IFC, have just released a guidance note on managing and identifying gender-based violence as well, as advice to our investee companies. In terms of how that might impact their economic, I think for us, we're thinking about why investors should care, and it's really sort of being able to look at the impacts that it would have for women being able to be active within the workforce. So from a perspective of women not being able to access the right forms of social infrastructure, helplines, support, that might have an impact on greater absenteeism within the workplace. It might challenge their ability to engage with their employment, and therefore naturally would have a higher risk of falling out. So it's really, for us, it's important that our businesses do care about this, are aware of it. And there's a number of ways in which we would suggest businesses do put in place measures to support and try and mitigate the risk of this, or support women who might be facing that through sort of essential grievance mechanisms, through having good reporting structures, through liaising with local support and charities and services on the ground who are able to help women as and when they feel comfortable reporting some of these instances. But certainly a really important and challenging issue that's been highlighted.
Adva, if I may jump in and build on I think what Arpita rightfully said. I think it's important also to think about each of these issues not just on their own, but to acknowledge that there are these linkages and that there are kind of mutually reinforcing negative consequences, right, that we are seeing play out. And gender-based violence is one part of this cycle of potential, lack of empowerment that women are facing. And it's also playing out in a related way through things like, I mean, it reflects or betrays a certain attitude about women being lower in the hierarchy. And as you think about that, what it's also meaning is that for women entrepreneurs or micro entrepreneurs, when financial capital is scarce in a household, their businesses or their needs might go to the bottom of the hierarchy. When a digital device like a phone is scarce because now, children need to use it all the time, for example, to, continue with their schooling, the male member of the household needs it too. So again, a woman's ability to use that device to access, banking or financial services or to do whatever business they're doing. So that actually falls. And of course, the disproportionate sharing of all the unpaid care work, which has actually increased by a factor of 30 to 40%, which is equivalent to 1.5 to 2 hours a day in most parts of the world. And the fact that on average around the world, 60 to 70% of this was falling anyway to the lot of women. And in this very unempowered situation, it's also very likely that, an even greater share comes to women, right? So all of these things act like mutually reinforcing loops. And unless we take the concerted positive action that Mary Ellen talked about, and so did Arpita, in terms of really seizing the opportunity to go out there and be very proactive about targeting women for things like financial inclusion or very targeted support for women-owned businesses. Or for example, really taking a stand and taking action on this notion of the care economy and saying that we want to acknowledge that this is a very valuable economic asset that we can build. It's a public asset that has huge social good as well as, big productivity benefits for families. And therefore, as part of the whole, stimulus and rebuilding program, even from a public finance standpoint, this is something that we want to invest in, right? So taking actions of this kind, I think are critical. And in the end, thinking about any one aspect of the inequality women face, each of them is important, but thinking about them holistically is also important because they do feed into each other.
Thank you, Anu. I want to turn now and sort of build off of that and pick up on something, Mary Ellen, that you said earlier, which is really looking at what are the potential opportunities. So, we've sort of had a pretty robust discussion of some of the challenges that we're seeing today. But as we sort of look ahead, both sort of rightly, as was pointed out, sort of in the immediate term, but also in the longer term, what needs to be done sort of during and coming out of this crisis to better support women, to help them access resources, and to sort of accelerate their participation in the economy, and also to ensure that gains that have been made aren't lost, that we don't see that sort of backsliding that I think is a real fear. So Mary Ellen, maybe we'll go to you. I know you've thought a lot about sort of what we need and what some of the potential responses and what the opportunity is. So if you want to sort of kick off this next section of our conversation, that would be great.
No, I'd be happy to, but I also think the seeds of it have actually been, planted in all of the remarks that others have made. I'm sure every single one of us on this panel has quoted the McKinsey Global Institute statistics that were published at the time of the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals about 20 trillion addition to global growth by 2030. I understand now that we're closer to 2030 than we were 5 years ago, and that opportunity is still ticking in front of us. But we've got a global economy that is going backwards. There is every single country that has published growth statistics is looking at recession, is looking at negative growth. You know, why isn't this an amazing moment to really start to address that equality of access to resources, to, you know, to jumpstart the growth that we haven't had before? I mean, it ties perfectly into this concept of building back better. You know, take something like the access to technology point that Anu made, you know, very, very rightly so. We had, you know, before COVID, we had, you know, on average 23 to 30% gender gap in access to smartphones. And one of the, I think, again, one of the biggest opportunities, you know, biggest concerns and biggest trends of this is how so much of our lives have been moving on onto digital services, as well as work. You know, every aspect of life has now moved digitally. If you don't give women that technology, if you don't have women with an assured access to that technology, they by definition are going to be left behind. So I'd say anything that can accelerate putting that smartphone in that woman's hand, and then really importantly, making sure she understands what to do with it. Digital and financial literacy has greater importance than it ever has before, but there's better data and better understanding of exactly what works and what doesn't work. That once women do have that capability training, they take on those technologies at least the same level that men do. In fact, perhaps even greater when it comes with some of the digital financial services access. I think Mamoun made some great points around the work that they're doing with women entrepreneurs, because what we've seen, again, pre-crisis, is that women don't just need the access to capital. They need access to training, and they need access to resources, to networks. And that combination is really fundamental to being able to move women's businesses forward. And so I just want to say two things on that. First of all, women entrepreneurs are much more likely to hire other women as they grow their businesses. And we know that access to capital is the number one indicator of whether a business is able to create more jobs. So you've got just this beautiful virtuous, you know, circle there in creating women entrepreneurs and the impact on women's labor force participation. And then just one other thing, I've been trying to make this point and get on my soapbox wherever I can. You know, I think the issue of formality and informality is again so fundamental. There is a direct linkage between formality and financial inclusion. Far more women are working in the informal sector than men. And as a result, it's just so much harder to find them, to find their businesses, to actually treat their needs. This is a time when governments having better incentive than ever before to make a case for formality. So, you know, in so much of the world where we work, you know, all you ever hear from an informal business is, oh, I don't want to register my business, I'll have to pay taxes. They only see the downside of informality. And so I do think this is this amazing moment for government to step in, working alongside the private sector, to point out all the real benefits, all the real upside to formality and what that can do in terms of that individual, that business, and then ultimately to economic growth.
Thank you. I think I want to go to our third poll now, because I think it's sort of really tied to what we're discussing at the moment and may give us some food for thought. And so that third poll is, how can the effort to build back better best support women? By creating more jobs in the formal sector, through laws and regulations, minimizing inequality, or by making it easier for women to start and finance a business. We'll give you just a minute to answer those questions. And I see that we've had a question come up. That was one I wanted us to get into, which is really looking at some of those cultural or structural barriers to women's engagement in the workforce, to their ability to start businesses. And so I want to ask some of you what you think, can be done in this moment going forward to help address some of those issues. Are there legal actions that need to be taken place? In some cases, even there's laws on the books, but the culture hasn't sort of caught up with the legal frameworks. And Mamoun, I might go to you on this because I know that you've done some thinking about how can sort of culture impact women entrepreneurs, and in the some of the training work that you've done, you've thought about those issues. So first we'll go to our poll results. Interesting. So making it easier for women to start and finance businesses. And so obviously that can have a whole host of purposes, but a good time, I think, Mamoun, to go to you because that's something that you've thought a lot about. So as we look forward and coming out of this crisis, what do we need to do to help women start and finance businesses? How can we address some of those cultural barriers that we're seeing?
I think you're right when you talk about cultural barriers. For example, in Morocco, the problem is not the fact that we have few women entrepreneurs, the fact that we have few women thinking of being entrepreneurs. If you see the Moroccan economy first, we see that there are what we say in French, aversion. The Moroccans, male and female, both, rather prefer being employees than starting a business. This is the first thing. But women more than men. And I think we need to do first is like, maybe at during education, maybe at university or in college, just to be sure that we try to encourage women to become entrepreneurs, and to give them the will to become entrepreneurs. This is very, very important. And this is, I think, the first step to do is to work with women to give them this will. We work we have 2 incubators in Morocco. We also work a lot with universities and business schools. And unfortunately, we have more men than women that comes. I want to become entrepreneurs. I have ideas, and I want to sell these ideas. Where the best ideas have come from women. But if you take the proportion, we have more male than female, which is not very interesting. And so we need to make this work again. When we talk about informal sector as well, the government needs to give something to these women. Let's say, for example, some special needs or some special helps dedicated to women, and to help them come to the formal sector. I think this is one thing as well that could be done. In Morocco, we have a global scheme that has been done regarding fiscality, for example. I think it's interesting. Today, if you are your own what we call auto-entrepreneur, so if you work for yourself, if you have less than $20,000 of turnover, you only pay 1% of taxes, which is quite interesting and quite nice to start for women. They can start with this and see if it works well. They can then go bigger and do other things. Frankly, just to share, we talk about experience and what we do as the researchers regarding this. I have only one thing to say: is we need to go to the field. Go to the field, work with women, go where they are, and try to convince them to start businesses. This is for the moment. This is the only thing to do, and we all need to do this at the same time. I don't know if you have figures in Morocco, but it's the same in Africa. All over. You have in Morocco 42% of young people between the age of 15 to 25 that are neither in school, neither in training, neither no school, no training, neither they do not work, no jobs. So 42% of this youth, male and female, is just thrown away basically. And what we're trying to do today is to take all this youth, male and female, and try to offer them job opportunities through entrepreneurship. And this is our goal. Today, we reach around 10,000 young people every year try to launch their company. We are very strict to have 50% male, 50% female. So in reality, we have 48% female, 52% of male. And this is what we need to do today, is to take people, as I always say, to stop thinking, stop being behind our computers, etc., and go in the field, meet these people, and try to see how we can help them concretely. It's with success story that we help women create jobs. One last thing is that, for example, if you take our countries, the whole African countries, if you want to say in French, narrer in success story, if you want to tell or write a success story of successful female or even male entrepreneurs, you won't find that much. You won't find, because they stay small, informal, mainly in like say grocery. You see what I mean? They buy and sell goods, no creation, and that stops there. So we need to start with great success stories of females, and with that you will bring more and more women to be entrepreneurs and to start creating businesses.
Thank you. Arpita, I want to go to you, because obviously, CDC has been thinking about gender for quite some time. And so when you look at, sort of this third poll result about building back better and the need to make it easier for women to start and finance businesses, when you look, we've talked obviously about the sort of COVID response, but when you look bigger picture about what CDC's role is in that, what can CDC do to make it easier for women to start and finance businesses? How are you going about really working with partners in the lowest income countries where there may be more barriers? And how do you potentially work with other parts of the government to look at, as you're identifying some of these more structural or legal barriers, to look at, what can the UK government or what can, other partners do to sort of help address some of those challenges?
Sure. So CDC, as you said, we launched our gender strategy 2 years ago, and the strategy focuses on 4 key categories. The first is looking at women's leadership, and that's a point I'll sort of elaborate on in a moment. But this is really ensuring that we look at how we can influence through our investments, getting more women on boards, getting more women into senior executive positions. The second category is around women's employment, and this is both the entry into employment and then once they're in employment, very importantly, how can we ensure that they have decent jobs, jobs that really meet their talent and their value. And so how can we advance their careers once they are in the workforce? The third is around much of what's been discussed today and your question around how to support women entrepreneurs, both with access to capital, but technical assistance as well, to be able to grow and scale their businesses. And then the final is looking at how some of the products and services that we invest in are designed for the female consumer. As we know, that's the one of the biggest rising consumer groups in emerging markets. So in terms of, as we look sort of into the future and where we can use this framework to support the rebuild agenda, I think want to emphasize how important it is to ensure that we have women's leadership, and this is both at the entrepreneur level, at all different sort of income groups and income segments, because of the cascading effects that Mary Ellen described earlier on in terms of women employing more women, and that can maybe help regain some of the economic fallout. But at the same time, also having women leadership in sort of bigger businesses, formal businesses, and really shifting some of the power dynamics that we see at play here, which has resulted in this disproportionate impact for women. So that's been a key area for us, and it's certainly a key area where investors can play a really significant role in ensuring that we get more women at the top in decision-making power, and also forming role models. To Mamoon's point, to the youth who are unemployed or seeking jobs, I think they look for people like themselves, and if there's an absence of women at the top, then they might not be so attracted into certain sectors. We are looking at supporting women enterprises, primarily through our financial institutions partners, and specifically really trying to understand what their specific challenges are. Much of what's been addressed today in terms of not just accessing finance, but using that in a way that can really help them grow and scale their businesses, and really understanding what the right routes to that access to finance is, and then sort of helping them link back up to the market and scale whatever goods and services they're providing. I think the other area is in terms of partnerships. You mentioned that's essential. We've been working a lot with many partners, recognizing that as a DFI, we certainly can't do everything, but we can certainly play our role. But partnerships in terms of those who are providing skills for women, who are especially skills for the future, so skills that help rebuild into new and emerging sectors and types of economies like the green economy, and ensuring that women are included in these types of skills is an area in which we are working with partners on. We are also working with a number of partners on trying to solve this issue of not having enough women in leadership positions. So the Boardroom Africa is one partnership that we have, which is a platform, an incredible platform across Africa, with over 1,000 women who are ready to sit on boards and senior management across the private sector. So definitely partnerships are really important to be able to help us meet some of our objectives. And then I'd say that just the final point around sort of addressing some of the structural barriers. We address this primarily through our work with our investee companies and through the businesses that we work with. And really it's here what's important is that we demonstrate the value that's lost by not having women take on responsibilities and jobs and functions which will bring value to a business, and also help women stay in the workforce for longer than we see a lot of dropout, particularly when women sort of enter the childbearing age. And what we've been focused on a lot over the past few years is putting in place interventions with businesses to ensure that women are supported throughout their career. And if we are looking at opportunities to think about building back better, one opportunity which this crisis we think has uncovered is greater flexibility in the workplace. And I think we've proven that is possible now. A lot of corporates were reluctant to sort of move to online, to working from home. But I think that can serve as quite a gender equalizer in terms of women's economic empowerment in the future.
Great. We've had several questions sort of asking about financing. So both in terms of the availability of financing specifically for SMEs, which in some sort of access to finance in certain countries has been limited. The need for sort of flexible financing for women in this response, and sort of how should investors evolve their approach to women's financing? And I think part of that is, what do we need? New products? Do we need products that are more designed for women. And Mary Ellen, I know that, Women's World Banking has done a lot of thinking about how to, push the financial industry to better design products for women. So maybe I'll go to you on this, but as we're looking at moving forward, how do we sort of ensure that financing is targeting sort of the smaller businesses, is flexible, and what do investors need to do to evolve to really serve the needs of women?
Thank you very much. This is kind of our life's work at Women's World Banking. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity. I think I'm going to sort of take that question in two parts, starting with the investor piece. Women's World Banking actually became an investor 8 years ago with our first impact investment fund, and we've now just launched our second fund. And I think one of the really important things we realized, sort of around that board table, around that shareholders meeting, is you've really got a lot of power there to drive how management thinks about bringing more women into the boardroom, into senior leadership, into staff. Arpita put it, very, very eloquently about why leadership is so important. We've also got some wonderful data. The IMF looked at, how did financial institutions that had more diverse leadership perform in the last financial crisis? And sure enough, they were much better able to come through the crisis in better financial shape. They do look at risk differently. Women tend to be the risk managers in their own home, and they bring a bit of that thinking into the boardroom, into the leadership positions. So there's not only all of the other wonderful economic benefits that we've been talking about here, but there is some really solid evidence about financial stability and maintaining good, solid financial systems as we go through these crises, if they have more diversity in general, and specifically gender diversity. So I think it's literally nothing more on the part of, well, I shouldn't say nothing more, but one of the first things that an investor can do is be extremely focused on diversity within the organization, diversity within a customer base, just asking those questions and putting the power of your vote, and if you have a board seat, behind making sure that those agendas are driven. Just a quick little anecdote, because I saw in the Q&A that there was some concern about no Latin America. So a great story, a bank that we're invested in Bolivia, really high performance bank, great outreach to women customers, but not so much on the senior leadership in gender diversity. We worked together with the other shareholders to put some gender diversity targets in place, and year one they weren't met, year two they weren't met, year three the compensation committee of the board, where Women's World Banking was not represented, we were on other committees, put it into the performance compensation plan of the very high performing CEO, and he got his bonus last year. So if you incentivize leadership, they'll do the right thing. So I really think investors have a much bigger role than they may even realize they do, just in performing the stewardship activities of their investment. But in terms of new products, no, we do not need new products. That's one of our real mantras. And I think when we start thinking about, women's products and a women's focus product, we tend to make it, this small, precious little thing, when women are, very, very good credit risks. They can perform well with, whatever standard product is, but sometimes that the infrastructure just doesn't support their ability to take those products. And I saw there was a lot of Q&A around property rights and land ownership. One of the most important things that we could do is for banks to really think through collateral requirements, even in the first place, and stop relying so heavily on collateral and really do closer due diligence on the business's ability to repay, but then also, if they're in many, many more countries, we've seen in the last 3 years, 18 African countries come online with movable collateral registries. So where the kinds of collateral that women are much more likely to have. So either, vehicles or equipment, or even more importantly, since so many women's businesses are service-based businesses, they can use accounts receivable as collateral against a loan. And that can make an enormous difference in terms of the risk profile and the capacity to borrow of a woman-led business. Credit bureaus, only, something like 93 countries in the world, or some enormous number of countries in the world, don't have credit sharing entities that deal with more than 5% of the adult population. The kinds of credit data that women have, like payments of utility bills, payment of retail payments that they may have made, far too many countries will see a woman build a credit history through microfinance where she's had great ability to repay, and none of that data gets transferred into the larger loan database when she graduates to borrowing from a larger bank. So there's some really important infrastructural changes that could be made that don't require new products, but do require, as you say, greater flexibility and addressing the kinds of things that hold women back. And they're not hard, and they can be very important. And I guess just one last point, and it links back to the gender-based violence point. The single greatest impact you can have in reducing gender-based violence, and there has not been nearly enough research on the interplay between financial access and gender-based violence, but is putting the name of a woman on a title to property. When a man has to deal with that woman in terms of putting a lien on the property, or borrowing, or even leaving the property, or having a family member inherit the property, if her name's on that title, that's a really important way for her to maintain some control. And there is a physical security as well as a financial security implication to it. So thank you. I've talked a lot, so thank you.
Thanks. We've had actually a ton of questions come in, and so I hope that you'll all bear with us. We are going to try to get to several more, but we are running out of time rapidly. We got several questions about mental health. And, mental health issues such as depression and anxiety that can really sort of undermine a woman's ability to fully participate in the economy. So how do you envision sort of integrating mental health support to women as part of this recovery? And Anu, maybe I'll go to you. I know you've, you talked already about how we need to look at the woman in a holistic sense. So curious if you have thoughts on this issue specifically.
It's I think it's great that it's an issue that's come up. It's not necessarily one that we have done sort of deep work on, but I think it's an issue that's actually crying, first of all, to be, for the spotlight to be shone on it in a little way, just to acknowledge that it's an issue. When we've looked at, researching multiple topics under this theme of gender inequality, one of the striking things is that you're very limited by what's considered important and therefore what's measured, right? So the data on many aspects which are important are actually just not available. They're not aggregated. There is nobody who's really tracking these. And I think the question of mental health actually comes into that. So when we've looked at healthcare access for women, we find that the more traditional aspects of, physical healthcare even are not very well represented, right, in the data. And it then boils down to things like maternal mortality or access to family planning, some of the reproductive health issues, right? But we need to go way beyond that as we think about what some of these deeper underlying barriers might be to the care of women. But I also want to take this opportunity to really give a thumping endorsement to everything that Mary Ellen just said, including, I think, one sort of key. She talked a lot about both asset ownership and asset building as part of boosting the self-esteem of women, and kind of changing the power dynamic in many ways. I think formalization is part of that process as well. When a woman has a formal history of engaging, whether it's a credit history or a payment history, or through financial inclusion and so forth. But I think one important key to unlocking all of these benefits and in many ways the kind of self-esteem of a woman is really identity. And I think in this day and age, if you look at lower income countries, it's really quite a grave problem when you think about the fact that 45% of women in low income countries actually lack the means just to prove who they are, right? For any high value or important kind of engagement or transaction with an institution. And this ratio is much more than that of men. It's 45% versus 30% for men, right? So a little bit of this sort of self-esteem and the feeling that you can engage with the world in a more formal way needs to begin with, I think, more thoughtful and more large-scale identity programs. And I think India has a great example of a universal digital identity program that has brought virtually over 95% of women into the fold of at least being able to start that journey of saying, here's who we are, and here's how we are moving ahead. And then Adva, if I may, there is also, and it again is linked to not so directly, but it's kind of linked to the mental health and mental well-being question as well, right? Which is, at the end of the day, it does boil down to what is valued in terms of the way we spend our time, and what is expected of women in terms of the way they spend their time. And world over, we continue to see that while many aspects of women's empowerment are acknowledged and there are policies in place, at the end of the day, the very gendered judgments that people pass about, or systems pass and countries pass and laws pass, right, about what is the rightful role of a woman and how should she be spending her time, and why that is much more skewed towards household work is a common global phenomenon. In the most formalized of economies, you end up seeing the highest drop-off rates happening after childbirth, when there are children, or at critical times in the life stage of a woman. And why is that? That's because these attitudes are so deeply entrenched. And again, that's emblematic of, I think, deeper problems to do with very, very gendered expectations on what men do versus what women do.
Thank you. Mary Ellen, a quick question for you. To follow up on something you said earlier, you really talked about the opportunity of more women having bank accounts today, of their ability to access finance. And so we had a follow-up question about that, really sort of asking, in the urban slums of Africa, what suggestions do you have to sort of take advantage of that surge and effectively lead women to financial services beyond this sort of short-term action? And we had another question also about, how do you ensure that both in this funding and in women's salaries, that women actually have control over that money? So obviously, perhaps having a bank account is a part of that, but it's not necessarily enough. So Mary Ellen, maybe we can start with you, and Anu, if you have comments after that, we can go there as well.
So I think the opportunity with these government benefits payments, particularly in response to COVID, is very exciting. On the one hand, on the sort of the negative side, we saw in a very quick response to buy on the part of governments, and many governments chose to digitize their payments, so they were going directly to the person, but they did not provide adequate information or capability either on the part of the recipient. So literally, women were not aware that the payments exist. You saw even in India, where, as Anu says, you've seen just huge ramp up in women's access to accounts. You saw very slow take up because women were not even aware that the payment was there. But you also didn't provide enough capability in many cases to the agents, to the facilitators of those payments. And we're seeing in so many countries women agents, women mobile agents, banking agents have been sort of the unsung first responders, because they're out there in the communities. They even prior to COVID, there was a much greater openness by both men and women to getting instruction on how to use a digital financial service by a woman agent. And so you're seeing, I think, a real resurgence in understanding that agent role could be, tremendously valuable. So making sure that she is as capable of providing both financial information, and increasingly she's becoming a trusted source of health information as well. So I think there's a labor force participation. There's a really interesting role for mobile money and banking agents that we can think of. And certainly in rural Africa, we've seen the rate of financial inclusion is directly tied to the greater availability of touch points with that mobile money provider. So I've become just a huge evangelist for those agents and building out those agent networks, and even more so now with the COVID payments. How do we, once the payments are moving on, how do we make sure that those bank accounts are still used? One very interesting solution we're seeing in Indonesia, where they've had a very successful digitized G2P payment program that they've really sort of converted to COVID response. They've increased the frequency of the payment, but even before COVID, they were thinking about graduation from the program. It can't be lifelong. How do we think about what happens next? And they've been thinking in the times of COVID of letting women use that payment specifically as security to borrow for to start a business, for example. So I think we've also seen some banks in Australia doing the same thing with some of their government benefits for women entrepreneurs to be able to access loans using that payment. So I think there's some really interesting possibilities there.
Wonderful. So we have just a few minutes left, and I want to give everyone an opportunity to sort of share some final thoughts. We had one question about sort of what are women-led sectors that should be a priority post-COVID, and maybe just curious. So if there's a sector that you think should be a priority, or if you want to share one key takeaway for our audience about what should be done, sort of concrete action that should be done to support women's economic empowerment sort of during post the pandemic, and how to sort of build back better, that would be great. And I'm going to ask each of you to sort of keep your remarks very short, under a minute, so we can try to finish up here on time. Arpita, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think that the sector that comes to my mind, as I think a lot of us have been discussing, is the care economy. And this is thinking about childcare services, elderly care services, and really to help women balance their work-life responsibilities, which isn't going to just sort of disappear once a woman has a job. These are structural issues, and so to the extent that we can facilitate it, I think it's important that we can think about how we can invest more in that very, very underserved, undervalued sector or economy. And then in terms of the one thing that we could do, I think, just to reiterate 2 points. The first is really the importance of women in leadership, and just how essential that is to try and address some of the power imbalances that we've seen. And secondly, to reiterate a point that Mary Ellen, you said, but I would 100% agree that for the investor audience here, we have a lot more influence and position of responsibility to be able to use our finance and direct that capital to address some of these inequalities that we've seen and has been exacerbated by the crisis. So I would say care economy, and then investing in women's leadership and investors playing an influential role in that.
Great. Mamoun, what are your thoughts?
I would say what I was saying earlier on, meaning that women should be assisted. Once again, technical assistance might be the key for women in Africa. This is what I really think, and we need to intervene at two levels. The first one is to intervene when they are at school or at the university. At the second level as well is when they have an idea or they start the business. This is when they need the more help to be pushed. And then I'm not really for positive discrimination, but I think we should also maybe create some clubs dedicated to women, really, just to help them to because there's also a problem of confidence, to gain confidence and to be able to work better and to create more opportunities, more. Voila, this is what I think.
Wonderful, thank you. Anu?
So for me, I think the theme that resonates the most is really helping women make transitions. And the reason is, I think the labor market's not a sort of static place, right? At any point in time, it's evolving. There are new kinds of skills in demand, new kinds of jobs. And that whole metabolic rate of change is being really accelerated by disruptions like COVID-19. And therefore, just enabling women to adjust to this dynamic labor market is critical. Two illustrations. One, we talked about sectors where women are affected. And I think the largest of these is actually the sector of accommodation and food services, which for obvious reasons now is, it's fallen off a cliff in terms of employment opportunities. And it's anyone's guess how soon it's going to come back. And therefore, if you think about women who are engaged in restaurants or food carts or that whole spectrum of retail work, they might actually need to find new kinds of work to do. And then on top of that, there's a huge impact that automation itself will have on changing the nature of work. And women have to learn to adapt to that, to learn how to use technology, to work alongside it, and then to do things that technology is not impacting, but is actually where women can play a bigger role. So across these, I think education, skilling in a very, very deliberate way, in a very specific way. So job-based skilling, which is narrow, specific, and doesn't involve huge commitments of multi-years of education, which women can scarcely do at the stage they are.
Right.
I think those things are going to be critical.
Thank you. And Mary Ellen, we'll wrap up with you. We're already over time, so if you can try to keep it as brief as possible.
Will do. I'm going to add my vote to Arpita for the care economy as the sector. There's ample evidence that if you provide childcare, if you put those systems in support, there is an increase in women's labor force participation. It's proven. Let's do it. And then just to reiterate, we've actually got some real financial inclusion opportunities that can lead to women's economic empowerment that have been created expressly in response to the crisis. Let's not lose this opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for a really wonderful conversation, and thank you to everyone who participated. I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions. It just shows sort of how much interest there is in this subject and its many layers. I do want to let all our participants know that we'll be sharing a recording. So if you missed anything, you'll be able to hear it later, and we'll also be sharing the wonderful illustration that Chris has made throughout this conversation. So again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much to our speakers for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.